Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the book of Genesis and chapter 36. The book of Genesis and chapter 36. As you work your way through the book of Genesis, you discover a recurrent phrase which occurs approximately 10 times throughout the book. And each time it occurs, it marks the beginning of a new section within the book. It's the phrase that you first come across in chapter 2, verse 4. You have it again in chapter 36, verse 1, chapter 36, verse 9, and chapter 37, verse 2. And that is the little phrase, "This is the account of." Or perhaps, more accurately translated, "This is the genealogy of," or "This is the offspring of," "These are the generations of." And those other translations, they explain why the name that is mentioned in this little phrase is usually the main character of the previous section, rather than the section that is just about to begin. So, for example, when it says in chapter 37, verse 2, "This is the account of Jacob," NIV, you may be left scratching your head and thinking to yourself, well, that's strange. I seem to remember that we did a series on the life of Jacob a little while back, and that was based on chapters 25 to 35. Surely that was the account of Jacob back then, was it not? Yes, that was the account of Jacob. But what you have introduced in chapter 37, verse 2, is better translated as the generations of Jacob, ESV, or the offspring of Jacob. And so whereas chapters 25 to 35 were primarily about Jacob, chapters 37 to the end of the book are primarily about Jacob's sons. But then, as we discovered a couple of weeks ago when we considered the subject of God's love, Jacob was not the only one of his generation. Jacob had a brother. His father Isaac had two sons, those being Esau and Jacob. And that's why before we get to chapter 37, which tells us about the generations of Jacob, chapter 36 tells us about the generation of Esau. Which brings me to my first point this evening, taken from chapter 36, and that is the apparent success of the ungodly. The apparent success of the ungodly. Now, following the disobedience, just to put in some of the background of where we've got to up to this point in the book, following the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God spoke directly to the three characters involved in that disastrous incident, and those were the man, the woman, and the devil. And to the devil, God said this, Genesis 3, verse 15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." Or better translated, between your seed and hers. And what you have from that moment on in the book of Genesis is a contrasting record of two lines of descendants from Adam and Eve. A contrast between two offspring, two seed. The seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It is a contrast that appears in chapter 4, the next chapter, the first generation after Adam and Eve. It appears there with Cain and Abel, Abel being the seed of the woman. And that is why, you remember, he's put to death, killed by his brother. But when his place in the family is replaced by Seth, we hear their mother Eve say in chapter 4, verse 25, "God has granted me another child," or more literally, "God has granted me another seed in the place of Abel." In spite of Abel's death, the seed of the woman continues. And so the two contrasting lines continue. You see the same contrast appear again in Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Although it was Ishmael that is born first, you hear God saying to Abraham in chapter 21, verse 12, "It is through Isaac that your offspring," or, better translated, seed, will be reckoned. And then you see it again in the next generation. Although Isaac and Rebekah have two boys, Esau and Jacob, it is Jacob that God sets his love upon. It is through Jacob that God chooses to fulfill his promises. It is in Jacob that the promised seed of the woman will continue. And yet what you discover is that although Ishmael and Esau do not belong to the chosen line of promise, the account of their generations are still recorded in Scripture. You have Ishmael's from chapter 25, verse 12 onwards, and you have Esau's in chapter 36. For example, in verses 1 to 8 of chapter 36, you read of Esau's descendants growing and expanding as a family unit, and they seem to have expanded at quite a rate, so that by the time you get to verse 8, verse 6 rather, you read chapter 36, verse 6, Esau took his wives and sons and daughters and all the numbers of his household, as well as all his livestock and all his other animals and all the goods he had acquired in Canaan, and moved to a land some distance from his brother Jacob. He did so because, verse 7, their possessions were too great for them to remain together. The land where they were staying could not support them both because of their livestock. So Esau, that is Edom, settled in the hill country of Seir. Sounds as if Esau's family is doing quite well for itself. Does it not? They seem to be doing all right. Not only is the family circle growing in terms of numbers, but their prosperity is growing as well. Economically, they're doing well. And as we continue working our way through the chapter, we see that growth continuing. For example, in verses 15 to 19, the emphasis has moved on from the immediate sons of Esau to chiefs over an ever-expanding clan. We've gone from a family unit to a clan. And there's a record of the various chiefs that ruled over that clan. And then from verse 31, the record of chiefs becomes a record of kings. In other words, the descendants of Esau have now become a nation known as the Edomites. And what makes this record of growth and prosperity and development amongst the descendants of Esau even more fascinating is that the history of the Edomites seems to be developing at a greater pace than the history of the Israelites. Is that not what you're meant to take from the reference in verse 31? These were the kings who reigned in Edom. That's not all it says. These were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. In other words, the descendants of Esau have become an established nation with an established monarchy before the descendants of Jacob did. And so you can just imagine. You can imagine being a descendant of Jacob, and you look over the border at the Edomites and their growth and their development and their prosperity. And you think to yourself, that's strange. That's a strange one. I always thought it was our ancestor Jacob who was loved and chosen by God rather than their ancestor Esau. I was always led to believe that it was us rather than them who belonged to the line of promise. I've always been under the impression that it is we who constitute the people of God, and that it is through us that God is working out his plans and purposes in this world. But if all that is true, then why do they seem to be so much more prosperous and much more successful than us? And so that being the case, what's the point? What's the point in belonging to this people rather than that people? Well, if that is what some of Jacob's descendants thought, then they wouldn't be the only ones or the last ones to do so. And why do I say that? I say that because if you read Psalm 73, you will hear Asaph, a later descendant of Jacob, you'll hear him say many years later, Psalm 73 verse 3, he also looked across the border, so to speak. And what did he say? He said, I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from the burdens common to man. They are not plagued by human ills. Verse 12, this is what the wicked are like. Always carefree. They increase in wealth. Surely, says Asaph, surely in vain have I kept my heart pure. In vain have I washed my hands in innocent. Have you ever thought like that as a Christian? You look around yourself, and the unbelieving people of this world seem to have it so easy compared to you and your fellow believers. Financially, they seem to be getting on very well. It's always them that get the big promotions in work. Their health seems to be so much better than yours. Their lives appear at times to be carefree, whereas you seem to be burdened by one problem after another. And consequently, it may just be that, like Asaph, you have thought to yourself, what's the point of it all? What's the point in being a Christian? Well, if that is what you have thought at times, then can I encourage you to read the whole of Psalm 73. Read the whole of it. Because by the time you get to verse 16, you hear Asaph say this. When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me. Till I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood their final destiny. Ah, says Asaph, that's what I had forgotten to take into account. Their final destiny. Yes, in the meantime, life may appear to be a breeze for the descendants of Esau. And life might appear to be a breeze for the people who were surrounding Asaph in his day. And life might appear to be a breeze for the unbelieving people around you, at least compared with your life at times. But what you have to remember is that this life is not all that there is. There is an eternity. There is an eternity. And it's when you see this life in the light of that coming eternity that you start to see things in their correct perspective. And that's why God's people in every generation have had to learn. They've had to learn to take the long view. They've had to learn to live by faith and not by sight. Is that not one of the great lessons of Old Testament history? It's certainly one of the lessons which the writer to the Hebrews took from it, having listed some of the big names from Old Testament history. In Hebrews chapter 11, he says this in verse 13. He says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were strangers and aliens on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country. Was it Wales? No. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Hebrews 11 verse 39, after he's mentioned so many more people from Old Testament history, he says this: "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would one day be made perfect." Well, Esau is a perfect example. He's a perfect example of someone who was short-sighted and only lived for the present. He demonstrated that by the fact that he sold his birthright for the momentary satisfaction of a pot of stew. But, says the writer to the Hebrews in chapter 12, "See that no one is godless like Esau." In other words, don't make the mistake he made. Don't live just for the present. Don't allow your life to be governed by what you see going on around you, including the apparent success of the ungodly. Instead, set your sights on all that God has promised you and all that God has prepared for you. And that is a heavenly city, a new Jerusalem. Set your sights on that. Live by faith and not merely by sight. Live in the light of that coming eternity, rather than being distracted and discouraged by the apparent success of the ungodly. Moving on, secondly, chapter 37. We see the amazing grace of God to the undeserving. The amazing grace of God to the undeserving. Now, as we move from chapters 36 into 37, we are not only moving from the descendants of Esau to the descendants of Jacob, that's quite obvious, but we are also moving, don't forget, from the seed of the serpent to the seed of the woman, to use the language of chapter 3, from the line of unbelief to the line of promise and faith. Did you get that? We are moving from the line of unbelief to the line of promise and faith. And so, that being the case, you might expect to meet in chapter 37 a people who are squeaky clean. A people who are morally and ethically impeccable. Well, if that is what you're expecting, then let's see if your expectations are met. Now, what we learned in the previous section of Genesis, chapters 25 to 35, you may remember, is that Jacob's family life was a little bit complicated, to say the least. Having been deceived, you may remember, by his father-in-law, he ended up marrying the sister of the woman that he intended to marry, and the one he intended to marry was Rachel. But then, having worked another 7 years, he finally got to marry the woman he loved. To make matters even more complicated, if it wasn't complicated already, there were two other women in his life, Leah and Rachel's servants, and between the four of them, Jacob had 13 children, 12 sons and a daughter. And from what we are told in chapter 37, it appears that some of the rivalry and some of the bitterness and some of the complications of Jacob's relationships have spilled over into the next generation. For example, in verse 2, we read of Joseph snitching on some of his brothers, and whether that was justified or not, we do not know. But what we do know by the time we get to verses 3 and 4 is that Joseph was hated by his brothers, and part of that hatred was due to the fact that Jacob loved Joseph more than the other lads in the family. On a human level, that favoritism was due to the fact that out of his 13 kids, only Joseph and Benjamin came from Rachel, the one woman out of the four that he really loved. And out of Joseph and Benjamin, Joseph was the first to be born. And as Jacob was no doubt getting on in years, Joseph's birth must have come as a great relief to Jacob. That's the reason, not the excuse, but that's the reason that's given for Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph. But to make matters worse, his favouritism for Joseph was clearly visible. He made no attempt to hide it. It was clearly visible for everyone in the family to see, because as we are told in verse 3, he made a colourful and richly ornamented robe for him, a robe which not only gave rise to Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, it also fueled his brothers' hatred and jealousy every time they saw him with it on. But then there was something else which fueled their hatred of Joseph. We are told in verse 5, and that was a couple of dreams he had. In the first dream, they were binding sheaves of corn, and their sheaves gathered round and bowed down to his. They weren't stupid, these boys. They knew exactly what he was trying to tell them. And that was, verse 8, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? The second dream had a similar theme to it. In that, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bound down to him. His father wasn't stupid either. It was pretty obvious what he was trying to tell them. Verse 10, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? Needless to say, his brothers' hatred and jealousy have only increased. And so it's not long before they decide to bring him down. Not just a peg or two, but bring him down in the fullest and final sense of the word. Verse 12 tells us of an occasion when Jacob sends Joseph out to the countryside to see how his brothers are getting on as they're looking after his sheep. But as they saw him coming in the distance, verse 18, they plotted to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of those dreams. Thankfully, the oldest brother, Reuben, intervenes in verse 21 and insists that they don't shed his blood. But what they did instead, verse 23, was take his colourful coat off him and throw him into a dry cistern. And having done that, this shows how callous they were. Having done that, verse 25, they sat down for a meal as if nothing had happened. They've just thrown their brother into a cistern, and they sit down for a meal as if nothing has happened. But then something did happen. They looked up and they saw some travellers on their way, some traders on their way down to Egypt. And Judah's suggestion, verse 27, was that they sell Joseph to these people. That is what they did. Verse 28, they sold their brother into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. And to round the catalogue of cruelty off, just in case you think it hasn't got bad enough, to round the catalogue of cruelty off, they went home with Joseph's coat soaked in blood. And they let their father believe that Joseph had been torn to pieces by some ferocious animal. Is this the squeaky clean family that you expected to find in the line of promise? Of course it's not. It's been anything but squeaky clean. A more dysfunctional family you would be struggling to find. It would take some imagination to think up a worse catalogue of hatred and jealousy and bitterness and cruelty within a family, would it not? And yet this is the family that God is going to work through. This is the line through which God is going to fulfill his plans and promises and purposes of redemption in this world. And if that demonstrates anything, it demonstrates the grace of God to the unbelieving. I say that because, like their father Jacob, not one of these men deserved to occupy a place within the chosen line. In some way, chapter 37 makes for sadder reading than chapter 36 did. Now, I appreciate that the two chapters are very different in nature. Chapter 36 is just a catalogue of names and who was born to who and where they lived and so on. Chapter 37 is getting into the detailed nitty-gritty of people's lives. I appreciate that it's two different types of chapters, but in chapter 37 it's as bad as anything that we read in chapter 36. And yet chapter 37 is the line of promise. And therefore not one of them deserved to occupy a place amongst the people of God. And yet they did, which demonstrates the undeserved grace of God in choosing the people through whom his work and witness in this world is carried on. As I said a couple of weeks ago, it was just as well God chose to set his love on Jacob prior to him being born, because he certainly would never have deserved it after he was born. And what was true of Jacob was true of his sons. And it continues to be true today. I hope you understand that. And that is why both Old and New Testament writers emphasize again and again and again, writing to Christian people in New Testament times, writing to Christian congregations, they emphasize time and time again that our place amongst the people of God is entirely due to one thing, and that is God's grace. For it is by grace you have been saved, says Paul in Ephesians 2, through faith, and this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And it is something that we need to be continually reminded of as Christian people. And you could argue that the longer we are Christians, the more we need to be reminded of it. And I say that because one of the temptations we face in the Christian life is the temptation of thinking that although we were originally saved by grace, there comes a point in the Christian life where we start to obtain some merit, just a little bit, some merit in the sight of God. It may be due to our increased knowledge of the Bible over the years. It may be due to our increased church commitment over the years. It may be due to what we perceive to be some growth in Christian character over the years. Whatever it is, we might just possibly begin to think that we're starting to pay our way in the Christian life. And that we're no longer dependent on the grace of God as we once were. But that is wrong. That is wrong. The man who wrote in Ephesians 2, for it is by grace you have been saved, it's the same man who wrote 1 Corinthians 15, by the grace of God I am what I am, present tense. Oh, please note, Paul had been converted some time when he wrote those words. Paul had preached hundreds of sermons by the time he wrote those words. Paul had been on various missionary expeditions and had planted several churches when he wrote those words. Not many Christians have the CV that the Apostle Paul had. And yet he acknowledges that it is by nothing other than the grace of God that he was what he was. As John Newton says, "'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and it is grace that will lead me home." There is divine grace all the way. And the sad story of Genesis 37 ought to remind us that it is only grace that enables us to play any part in the unfolding of God's plans and purposes in this world. That is the amazing grace of God to the undeserving. Thirdly and finally, chapter 37 again, and there we see the obvious sovereignty of God in history's unfolding. The obvious sovereignty of God in Israel's unfolding. Now, back in chapter 12, you may remember that back in chapter 12, we read of God making some great promises to Abraham, and one of which was a promise to make him into a great nation. In chapter 15, that promise is repeated with the reassurance that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But as you may remember, Abraham and Sarah had one child only, a boy called Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had two boys, Jacob and Esau, but Esau was ruled out of the promised line. And so it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that over the first two generations, progress in becoming a great nation has been slow, to say the least. Slow. The descendants of Abraham, 2 generations on, the descendants of Abraham are just surviving and no more. But now that Jacob has 12 sons, population growth is now a distinct possibility. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, yes, being 12 of them, they may have had numbers in their favour, but from what we've just read in chapter 37, it appears that a worse 12 you would be struggling to find. And you have a point. If the apparent success of Esau's descendants took us a little bit surprised in chapter 36, then I suspect we're equally surprised by the apparent chaos of Jacob's descendants in chapter 37. So much so that you may be wondering how God would ever be able to fulfill any plans or promises of his through this band of brothers. Brothers who are characterized by hatred and jealousy, strife and people trafficking. And yet the amazing thing is that it is precisely through this motley crew and all of their antics that God will work out his plans and fulfill his promises. For example, back in chapter 15, God told Abraham, verse 13, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and ill-treated 400 years. And you may be thinking to yourself, Jacob and his boys, they're quite comfortable in the land of Canaan. How is that ever going to come about? How are they ever going to be enslaved in a foreign country when they're quite comfortable in their own country?" Well, I don't want to spoil the rest of the story, but just to say that those 2 dreams Joseph had, they weren't the result of eating too much cheese. They were God-given dreams which indicated that out of the 12 brothers, Joseph would play a key role, not only in the affairs of the immediate family, but also in the affairs of God's people. And did you notice that by the end of chapter 37, Joseph is now down in Egypt? And that is only the first indication that God is at work, working out his plans. And what we will discover as we work our way through these chapters is that a sovereign God is at work all the time. Oh, there's many times when it's not very obvious, so much so that the title of a little book on Joseph is The Hidden Hand of God. And yet all the time God is working. He's working to get this family down into Egypt. Not only so that the promise to Abraham back in chapter 15 will come true, but so that during their time in Egypt, and under the many years of protection of the Egyptian state, when they were treated favorably, they will undergo a population explosion and become as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through their subsequent deliverance from Egypt will provide subsequent biblical writers with one of the greatest themes and one of the greatest illustrations of God's dealings with his people throughout history. Think about it. If Jacob's descendants had never gone to Egypt, if they never get down to Egypt, there would be no exodus from Egypt. There would be no Passover lamb. And yet from where we stand in history tonight, having a completed Bible, we can see how important those things are to the rest of the Bible storyline. You know how important those things are. How important they are to the rest of the Bible storyline, and how important they are to our understanding of the great salvation that God has provided for us in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, whom the Apostle Paul, you may remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, describes him as our Passover lamb. None of that imagery would be possible if Jacob's sons don't end up down in Egypt. But it is here in Genesis 37 that the journey down to Egypt begins. And so we see in this chapter the obvious sovereignty of God in the unfolding of the history of redemption. And the fact that God was working out his plans and purposes, and the fact that God is fulfilling his promises through such a dysfunctional family as this, ought to provide us with the great reassurance tonight that in spite of all our failings and faults, and in spite of all our messed up backgrounds, and in spite of our far from ideal circumstances in life, God is still able to work out his plans and purposes in this world through people like you and me. You look back over your personal history, your upbringing, your family circumstances, your recent circumstances in life, and you think, how can God ever work through someone like me? Well, you read Genesis chapter 37 and you'll find out. Three big themes we see in Genesis 36 and 37. The first is the apparent success of the ungodly. The second is the amazing grace of God to the undeserving. And the third is the obvious sovereignty of God in the unfolding of history.